Here's the thing, right? I was already predisposed to liking the series because I already enjoy trashy, junky, power fantasy isekai on the regular. Throw tokusatsu superheroics on top of that, and regardless of how bad it turned out, the Red Ranger becomes an adventurer in another world would have probably still been prime popcorn material. But oh my goodness, this series has no business being as good as it is. While a lot of this series' opening gags plays it as if it were an isekai being overwritten by sentai tropes, in the long run, the addition of these tropes transforms it into a more classical fantasy adventure. And I think that's actually exemplified really well with the titular Red Ranger Togo Asagaki. Unlike a lot of isekai protagonists, the story doesn't actually follow him from the moment he sets off in this fantasy setting. It actually picks off some months later, after Togo's largely already gotten acclimated with this world. The series gives the audience a near taste of Togo as a facsimile of an overpowered isekai protagonist in its opening chapter and episode, and then almost immediately slams him into the power scaling wall. So what if Togo has the whole Megazord and his team's big finisher cannon at his disposal? He has no team to use it with, severely limiting his efficacy. The same narrative conventions that make Togo so strong also shackle him. He fundamentally cannot be a conventional isekai protagonist because by his meta-contextual nature, Togo is a ranger who works best in a team, facilitating the need of a party. Togo's also a quintessential hot-blooded Red Ranger, the type who really kind of needs other contrasting characters to temper his enthusiasm for the sake of tonal balancing. We've had boisterous Reds of this type before, and it's always a bit of a gamble as to whether they'll hog the bulk of the spotlight, but in this instance there was almost no shot that Togo would end up doing the same because his co-leads are just as much main characters as he is. For instance, Yedra is ironically more of a viewpoint character than Togo, in spite of being a character who is already resident to the setting the Ranger ends up in. A lot of the humor early on is derived from her reacting to the tokusatsu-isms that naturally arise as a result of Togo's mere existence, but it also goes a step beyond the simple clash of genre conventions. Early on, she tries to get a read on Togo via his status screen, and in lieu of an RPG list of stats and skills, it's this loud splash page that one might find in a magazine or on a website. Yedra is also very predictably befuddled by the explosions, the poses, the costuming, and the very talkative transformation device, all relatively specific aspects of the Toku superhero subculture. She's the one being culture shocked by elements from another world. It's vaguely reverse isekai-ish in that respect. For the audience who's not super familiar with these quirks either, I imagine she is something of a surrogate. I'm also low-key convinced that if left to her own devices, Yedra will just inevitably form a harem around herself. In fact, she kind of had one for all of 2 to 3 pages, even if they're all technically sort of variants of the same person. Elsewise, she's the brains of the group, playing excellently off how Togo's obviously the brawn. Logi is one of the most Lancers to have ever Lancered, and also seems to be a specific sub-archetype of power fantasy protagonist, the type who is shunned or deemed lesser because of the way that the systems that be determine merit in the setting, only to find that their specific quirks makes them the strongest or what have you. In Logi's case, he has no magical talent in a magic fantasy setting, but that makes him perfectly suited to wield the magic-guzzling sword of the Chosen One. This character theming extends to his skill set as well. Logi has the type of well-rounded, self-sufficient power set one might expect of an overpowered protagonist of his ilk. However, in contrast to a lot of characters of Logi's archetype, who typically sort of automatically form a clique about them once they have a firmer grasp of their innate talents, Logi's a lot more socially abrasive. Because of course he is. He grew up in this setting that saw no value in forming connections with him, and this resulting aversion to human contact leads him to clashing often with the comparative social butterfly Togo. Teltina, despite being the lone non-combatant of the party for the longest time, is in some respects the most main character of the main characters. She's the focal locus of a lot of otherwise disparate narrative elements and backstory, and it's also her machinations that draw the rest of the core cast together into a single unit. Her unique abilities are also what allow the monster of the week plots, as it were, to be resolved, so there is technically no plot progression without her. Also, Teltina's definitely at least a little bit Makai Knight coded, right? She's a warrior of a prestigious lineage clad in wolf-themed armor who wields demonic power kept in check with sheer force of will. That feels somewhat self-evident. There's also this really cool implicit duality between the two pairs. Togo wears a mask, and Yedra gains one eventually, and these masks fundamentally make them more of what they already are. But by contrast, the maskless Logi and Teltina have aspects of themselves that they'd much rather keep hidden. So, who is really wearing the masks? It's Rania. The answer's Rania, the resident walking Kamen Rider reference. They go all in on the superhero alter ego dual persona thing with her, so Rania is simultaneously this adorable Blorbo who literally and figuratively transforms into the more stereotypically heroic Amin. I don't know if it's intended to be directly referential, but it definitely feels reminiscent of how main riders can often be the same, these sort of atypical protagonist goobers who are nonetheless capable of stepping up to protect those in need when the situation calls for it. It's through Rania that we also get shades of the legacy theming that's often implicit to these longer-running Toku franchises, since Amin is one of those superhero mantles that's passed down from generation to generation. The disconnect between the dual identity stems in part from Rania feeling like she's not fit for the Amin buckle. Of course, the irony that's slowly revealed later is that there have been oddball Amins who were nonetheless capable heroes when the situation called for it. Rania's living up to her lineage just fine. Also, that is one of the absolute sickest rider kicks I've ever seen. Putting your enemies in the grave by driving a pharaoh's tomb into them is a wicked finisher concept. In general, this series very faithfully adapts the visual language of contemporary tokusatsu superheroics. The Toku arsenals stand out to me in that those weapons aren't hamstrung by the limitations of live action anymore. They can be a bit more fantastical, since these don't have to be physical props, but they largely retain that toyetic, tactile finger candy quality anyway. They're not super beholden by Toku convention either. There's this one particularly cool thing this series does a lot, where it'll show the eyes of the transformed character through the eyepiece of the helmet for the sake of emotional emphasis. Obviously not something that the live action shows get to do super often, on account of the suit actors and the face actors typically being different. That digression aside, fantasy adventures of this type typically live or die by the core characters and how well they play off each other, and yeah, that's true of a Sentai series as well. But this series finds that very snug middle ground where all the core characters eventually become well-rounded enough that they work individually outside of group dynamics as well. What is, on paper, a list of caricatures with very particular genre gimmicks turned out to be a surprisingly well-balanced cast. Who'd have thought?